Thanks everyone for being here. So, as all book lovers will know, the pleasures of books are deeply physical. They start with the smell of the bookshop, the tactility of handling the objects, and the visual feast of multicolored covers. They continue with the bodily handling and turning of the pages, the contact with writing, which is at the interface between orality and image, and the desire to start reading, that is, to take lines for what promise to be exciting and rewarding walks. And then there are the pleasures of written language in its most evocative, sensuous, and carnal form. The conjuring up of images, sounds, smells, bodies of things, bodies of persons, places, movements, and situations. Suddenly, the dead medium becomes fully awakened and alive, a conduit through which to engage in sensorial and sensuous understanding and reflection. One of the goals of this paper is to think about the ways that this quotation from Hamalakis's Archaeology of the Senses does and does not apply to ancient texts by investigating the sensorial experiences of Cypro-Minoan inscriptions and pot marks. I've followed Hamalakis's exhortation to incorporate my own sensorial experiences and memories of researching Cypro-Minoan pot marks into the discussion. The idea for an epigraphic foray into the archaeology of the senses came from Artemis Georgiou, the lead investigator of the ERC-funded COMPASS project, Commercial Patterns Across the Sea, where I am a postdoctoral researcher. And I'm indebted to her for suggesting the idea, which has allowed me to see a material that I've dealt with for a long time now with new eyes. I both began reading Archaeology of the Senses and writing this paper on 2 recent trips to the US. The first to sort my husband's green card, a trip that not 6 months ago would have been routine, but under Trump's fascist regime was fraught with anxiety. And the second to attend my lovely grandmother's funeral. I think my grandmother would have liked a paper about archaeology of the senses. She liked to dress well, cook well, and eat well. She wouldn't have been particularly excited about the archaeology part, but she would have been curious about it in her usual way, asking me again and again to remind her what exactly it is that I study, where Cyprus is, and so on. So I'd like to dedicate this paper to Selma, my Nana, who left the world on Saturday. My memories and fondness for her have shaped it. The Cypro-Minoan script and its associated marking practices were used on the island of Cyprus from the onset of the late Cypriot period, circa 1650, through the transition into the Iron Age. Of the around 300 Cypro-Minoan inscriptions, 1/3 are short text incised, mostly post-firing, into ceramic vessels. The majority of the 1,500 plus pot marks or marked objects are also ceramic vessels. As our conference organizer, Philippa Steele, who can't be here today for her own personal reasons, has noted, following and building on the work of Nicole Hirschfeld, the types and context of the inscribed vessel text as compared to the marked ceramic vessels is indistinguishable, suggesting that both the inscriptions and pot marks served similar or identical functions. Both types of vessels are broadly considered to have mercantile associations, so associated with overseas trade, because many of the marked vessels are on imported vases, and because most of those marks and inscriptions were made post-firing, with the implication that their content or function was unrelated to the pottery production context, rather related to circulation. The label mercantile, which I promote in my own work, is rather broad, and in using it, it must be borne in mind that vessel text, while having mercantile associations, can have many other associations and uses as well. And it doesn't negate the many other possible non-mercantile dimensions of their use. Often made post-firing on visible parts of vessels, the vessel marks and inscriptions would have been visible to and passed through the hands of a wide range of actors. It is the visual and tactile properties of the inscribed and marked vessels, especially that I want to explore in this paper, thinking about how those properties would have affected the people who interacted with them, contributing perhaps to their graphic potency. Inscription 158 on a Cyprus-produced plainware jug excavated from the sanctuary site of Mirtu Pygades is conserved at the Ashmolean Museum, which is where I met it. The Ashmolean study rules are stricter than some other museums I have studied at. I left my backpack and water at the entryway, donned a pair of medical gloves, and received the jug on a black foam tray. Inspecting it, the first thing that jumped out to me is how narrow the incision lines are, almost to the point of being inconspicuous. And I felt the plastic of the medical gloves bunching beneath my fingers as I traced the lines. A very different tactile experience than surely what would have been in the Late Bronze Age. The jug's 4 signs are relatively large and clearly incised, especially the final sign, which is positioned underneath the spout. To me, there's an apparent tension between the prominent placement of the final sign and the fineness of the incision lines, which make them hard to see. Would the fine ecru-colored incision lines stand out against the beige rouge of the fabric any more in the past than they do now? How close would the viewer have had to stand to the jug to notice the incision lines? How still? Couldn't they have easily been overlooked? Yet the large sign underneath the spout seems poised for a viewer, its arms outstretched, shouting for attention. The sign might have been especially eye-catching right before the liquid was poured from the jug, especially in the context of ritual display where the jug might have been held out to an audience before pouring. That the jug would have been displayed theatrically in a ritual context is almost certain. It was found in room 16 at the sanctuary site of Mirtu Pigades in one of a series of 3 small rooms that held other ritual equipment associated with metallurgical activity in bovines, including bronze ring stands, 2 of which are inscribed, and incised bovine shoulder bones. According to Louise Hitchcock, the small size and lack of accessibility to these 3 rooms where the ritual equipment was found may indicate that ritual practices and feasting of a private and restricted nature took place, in contrast to the more public activities that must have occurred in the West Court, raising the possibility that the jug had a very intimate viewership. In an enclosed setting, the inscription might have been lit by flickers of candlelight. The air might have been full with the smell of burnt offerings and the anticipation of intoxication signaled by the presence of the jug and its contents. The sensorial experiences of the inscription would have been mediated by booze, beef, and a sense of the divine, regardless of the inscription's content. According to Nadia Saramatakis' 1994 definition, commensality involves the exchange of sensory memories and emotion, and of substances and objects incarnating remembrance and feeling. In this type of exchange, history, knowledge, feeling, and the senses become embedded in the material culture and its components. Specific artifacts, places, and performances, the graphic signs and the inscription among them. The jug and its writing would have been imbued with sensorial memories of commensality and the associated rupture in everyday timelines such events can engender. The jug's writing may have even taken on an aura of otherworldliness in the flicker of the light of the booze. Another vessel, T110-401, was likewise likely employed in ritual contexts, but to potentially different effect. It's a Mycenaean cup currently held at the Cyprus Museum. I can't remember the exact circumstances when I first saw it, but it likely came on one of the Cyprus Museum's many wooden trays filled with other potmarks for me to study by the museum staff. Perhaps it was just past 10 a.m. and I had finished a cup of Cypriot coffee, or maybe it was closer to 2 and my stomach was rumbling, waiting for visiting hours to close for the day. Whatever the circumstance, it was love at first sight. The big, bold, painted sign in the vessel's interior immediately captured my imagination, as I'm sure it does yours right now. The painted strokes are satisfyingly thick and clear, and done in a pleasing red tone, characteristic of other Mycenaean vessels painted with marks and occasional inscriptions. The writer of this sign certainly wanted it to be seen, and not just seen, but tasted. The cup was found in tomb 110 at Encomi, excavated by the French mission. It was a notably rich intramural tomb, from which 7 other marked objects come, including 5 Mycenaean drinking vessels. The preponderance of serving and storage vessels in Cypriot tombs has led to the general consensus that feasting was associated with funeral practice, but the small size of most tombs and the difficulty of accessing them suggests, according to Lindy Crew, that associated commensal acts took place above ground. Whether in daylight or moonlight, we don't know. We also don't know if the person drinking from the cup would have seen it before the ritual's commencement. Confronted with the sign, the drinker likely would have experienced anticipation at the sign slowly revealing itself. as the liquid drained, followed by surprise and even pleasure as the extent of the full sign was revealed. Perhaps it was a conversation starter. But what was the conversation it was meant to start? I doubt that the sign had ritual significance for two reasons. First, because painted marks on Mycenaean vessels are overwhelmingly associated with trade contexts. And second, because the sign in the cup's mouth, CM27, is a prevalent pot mark found on a variety of objects without apparent ritual associations, but with strong mercantile ones. So for instance, we have a copper tool from the Galadonia shipwreck with that sign. Therefore, the sign itself is almost of certain mercantile rather than ritual significance. And yet, whoever marked the Mycenaean cup, a type of vessel with clear ritual and commensal associations, could have reasonably assumed that it would have been employed in ritual and imagined a drinker's lips kissing it and coming face to face with the sign during a ritual. In other words, whoever marked the cup intended its drinker to have an effective sensorial experience while encountering the mercantile sign. One reason for engineering a sensorial and emotional encounter with CM27 is that it's one of a set of marks that might have functioned like modern-day brands. Unlike modern-day brand logos, however, which refer back to the producer or seller of a commodity, this set of marks refers back to the vessel distributor or group of distributors, as first theorized by Nicole Hirschfeld. The range of sensorial experiences evoked by the cup, including sight, taste, surprise, and humor, recalls the concerted effort of advertisers to elicit acute and memorable sensorial responses in their consumers. Evoking an emotional response is an effective way to quote, enrobe a commodity in personality, transforming it from an anonymous object into a desirable commodity. The sign itself might not have been the only effective or evocative sensorial component of the mark. It's possible that the red color in and of itself was evocative of commercial activity and notions of ownership, particularly in the arenas of animal husbandry and textiles. Both Mesopotamian and Hittite texts record words that plausibly connote both the color red and the practice of marking. From Nuzi, the word shimu specifically means a red mark as applied to a sheep or other livestock. Ugaritic records the word, and since we don't know the vocalization, I'm just going to say chet resh, taf, a color, meaning a color or dye, crimson red, which Kakko also translates to mean a firebrand through the association with a possibly cognate Hebrew word chara. More controversially, the Ugaritic root word pwt, translated as red matter, is associated with the Hittite word puwati, which is glossed in a bilingual with the Akkadian word shindu, meaning mark. However, it's also associated with a second word, shebada, which means neither mark nor red dye. For that reason, Hoffner has argued that the Hittite scribe misglossed the word and that the Hittite puwati shouldn't necessarily be associated with the Ugaritic pwt. Be that as it may, the associations between the color red and marks seems to be fairly established and widespread geographically and chronologically within the region. And the color red very well may have been used to mark animals or cloth on Cyprus. When the color was seen on Mycenaean vessels, these other associations, such as ownership or commerce, might have also come to mind. A less visually evocative, but nevertheless sensorial-rich example of pot marks are found on Canaanite jars, most of which, during the Late Bronze Age, are marked on their handles when the clay was dry. The incision lines on Canaanite jar handles often blend into the handle surface to the extent that it can be difficult to determine whether incision lines were made before or after firing, as there's minimal change in surface color between the incision lines and the handle surface, and the lines are often smooth. An example of two handles, possibly from the same vessel originally, from Kalavassos Ios Dimitrios, illustrates the inconspicuousness of some Canaanite jar marks. Despite their dullness of color, there's a good chance that the marks were meant to be seen, if not touched. My colleague Sidris Kataloy, who has handled the largest number of complete Canaanite jar vessels of anyone I know, has concluded that they were probably not gripped by their handles, but by their bellies. Instead, the handles were used for tying vessels to one another during transport. If that is correct, then handles would have been visible to transporters during both the carrying and the securing of the vessel. As for me, when I carry complete jars, I tend to grip them around their waist, at their hips, much like an 8th grader dancing her first slow dance. And I come eye to eye with the handles as I carry them. Perhaps this was the technique used by someone in the late Bronze Age, or perhaps a more efficient technique was developed. But it's at least plausible that the vessel handlers would have come eye to eye level with the marks while carrying them. It's also reasonable to infer that the person or persons responsible for securing the vessels in place by weaving rope through them would have come eye to eye with their signs. Despite the relative inconspicuous incision line of many Canaanite jar marks then, they would have nevertheless been quite visible to those responsible for carrying and securing them. What's less clear is the degree of tactile engagement with the marks. Though the Canaanite jar handles, as Idris has said, likely weren't gripped for transport, it's at least worth asking whether they would have been gripped for the filling or the emptying of the vessels. Would transporters have idly traced their fingers along the incision lines while standing or sitting among the vessels, waiting for instructions to move them? Very well, could be the case. The 2 marks on the handles from Kalavassos seem to have had a special significance at the site. The same 2 signs are incised on the handle of a jug that also comes from Kalavassos. Both the jug and the Canaanite jars were found in different areas of the same southeast building complex. And they share the same strange characteristic. One of the signs appears to be made before firing and the other after firing. The shared 2-sign sequence, with its mix of before and after firing signs, raises a number of interesting questions about where the signs were incised and in what order. If at least 1 sign on each vessel was made before firing, then the addition of the 2nd sign was likely to have happened at Kalavassos, while the incision of the before firing sign is likely to have happened elsewhere. The Canaanite jar is almost certainly an import, and Priscilla Keswani, who I had the pleasure to bump into in the storerooms at Larnaca when I was studying this material, has suggested that the plainware jug too is an import, but this time from within the island, from its southwest. The meaning or the significance of these marks altered then as the vessel traveled. The addition of the 2nd signs on the Kalavassos handles demonstrates the inherent multivalence of marks as they move from point A to B to C, and as they exchanged hands and greeted new eyeballs along the way. The potential for multivalence, the difference of meaning that the marks must have held for different people encountering them in different circumstances, is at least partially a result or caused by the different sensorial experiences that the people who use them would have felt. This is as true of the Kalavassos marks as the other 2 examples discussed today, and where I see some of the greatest potential for archaeology of the senses to enhance our study of the pop marks. And I hope that today's presentation has provided you a taste of that potential as well. Thank you.